Right, there we go. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Oliver Dodd, one of three co-directors here at the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Charlotte Heath-Kelly, who is a Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. Her research explores how counterterrorism is entering the realms of social care, healthcare, and education, blurring the boundaries between national security, social security, and civil society. She currently leads a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council called Neoliberal Terror, the Radicalisation of Social Policy in Europe. Charlotte has published 2 monographs, 5 edited books, and more than 30 peer-reviewed journal articles, exploring the expansion of counterterrorism in the war on terror era into unexpected areas like memorization, health, and social care. Today's talk is titled Covert Care, Welfare Distribution by Counterterrorism Police and MI5. Charlotte will be talking for approximately 40 minutes, and we'll follow this, as usual, with a similar amount of time for the Q&A. Charlotte, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I will just start sharing my screen and getting it onto the right page. So hopefully that is now displaying some PowerPoint slides at you. So yeah, as Oliver said, today I'm going to be addressing the topic of intelligence agencies and security agencies distributing care and welfare, which we might find rather surprising because that's not their core business, or at least it wasn't historically. So it's never, multi-agency work has been with us for a while, and multi-agency work tends to involve some local police, and in the UK this has included multi-agency work in sort of gangs, troubled families programs, child sexual exploitation, and also preventing countering violent extremism. So there is a history, a limited history over the last sort of 2 decades of local police being involved in preventive work with other frontline agencies. And these are very specific officers. They're preventative officers who do this kind of work. And yeah, they work with their colleagues in social care, health, to try and, avert crime. But the question I sort of are raising today and in my research is, what would it mean if intelligence and security officers became involved with this kind of work? What if they were sharing information with and receiving information from frontline services without your consent? And that's the topic of discussion today, and it has been happening very recently, since about 2016 in the UK. And as a sort of note of caution, before we get into this talk proper, CT policing, counterterrorism policing, it's important to know who they are before we begin this talk. So they are not your local police force. They are a national organisation broken up into regions, but they're effectively the operational arm of MI5. So MI5, the intelligence agency, they can't actually arrest you or intervene upon you in any way. They just surveil you, and they pass the results of their investigations onto counterterrorism policing, because they have the authority as a police body to actually arrest you, detain you, prosecute you. So counterterrorism policing are not standard policing. It's kind of difficult to define them in a way. They sit on the boundary between normal policing and intelligence agencies. So for the rest of this talk, just remember that CT policing is not your standard officer. This is a very security-oriented role with lots of contact day-to-day with MI5. So they're quite serious. I'm also going to introduce you the 3 sort of UK programs of note before we get into talking about why they're interesting. I'm just going to sort of demonstrate to you what they are and that they exist, because none of these are statutory provisions. They're not involved in much law. These are effectively covert programs that eventually we find out about through FOI requests, and then eventually the government admit that they exist. So the first one is called MAC, It stands for Multi-Agency Centre. Now, this has been listed in the latest contest strategy, which is the counterterrorism strategy. And MAC is very specific. It's basically when MI5 stop investigating somebody, a subject of interest, when they decide this person isn't worth any more resources or time. But we're not just going to let them be, because they might still, reactivate as a threat. So they pass that subject of interest to the multi-agency centre, and it's no longer dealt with by MI5. It's instead dealt with by counterterrorism policing. And the aim of MAC is to keep an eye on them, to surveil them, but at a lesser level than a MI5 investigation, but also to divert them using all other manner of tools covertly. So effectively, MAC and the other programs that I'll talk about offer a very deluxe welfare state package covertly. So you never know that what you're being provided with by your local authority, it's actually come at the direction of the intelligence agencies and counterterrorism policing. So to keep somebody on the straight and narrow, it can be possible to reaccommodate them, give them a new accommodation if it's felt that they're living too close to somebody who might, draw them back into terrorism. You can arrange apprenticeships, college places, expedited mental health care, all kinds of things. Anything you can think of, then the multi-agency centre will be able to obtain it. And this is done covertly for those deemed potentially dangerous / vulnerable. These two intersect. And to do this, to know what they should give these potentially dangerous people to keep them on the straight and narrow, the vulnerability support hubs play a role doing a psychological and social analysis of the risks and protective factors that affect this person. We'll talk about them later. So basically, MAC is one of these programs where the intelligence agencies and counterterrorism policing offer care and welfare to deter someone from terrorism. Just introducing the next program that takes this approach, police-led partnerships. This is not in any UK government policy. I found out about this. This is my find. So through endless FOI requests, it became clear that there was another prevent strategy, a covert one. And this is effectively what police-led partnerships are. Now, they're led by counterterrorism policing. They have input from MI5, but they're not specifically for closed subjects of interests from MI5, so a bit broader than MAC. And how do you end up in police-led partnerships? Well, this is a covert management policy like MAC. Why would you end up on this rather than prevent? Well, it's a more serious, more covert version of prevent. It's led by CT policing, and you'll end up on it if you've refused prevent. You don't want to take part in a prevent intervention to address your vulnerability. So if you refuse it, you end up on this more covert prevent anyway. You might have a relative under investigation by counterterrorism investigations. So that would be another reason why you'd end up on this program being surveilled. Or you might have participated in an extremist leafleting or stickering campaign. All of this has been obtained through FOI releases. And what does this one do? Well, it's just like MAC, really, in that CT policing, they design a support package to try and keep you on the straight and narrow with input from this socio-psychological mapping of your personality and what's going to drive you to commit an act of terrorism, what's going to keep you safe. And this deluxe welfare state package is provided to you according to what the psychiatrists say that you might need. So again, this can be apprenticeships, college places, housing, whatever you need. But at the same time, CT policing will surveil you, keep an eye on you, and they can also use disruption tactics, which are a lot rougher. They're not care measures. So this program is quite ambiguous. They can prosecute you, go after you for non-terrorist offences, and also undermine your support in the networks. So if you're a leader in a particularly conservative, and I mean kind of jihadist network, then they can come at you with allegations that they don't even have to prove, that would diminish people's trust in you within those networks. So that's one of the tactics that they can use, but mainly welfare state and care measures. And the third program that does this kind of approach are the vulnerability support hubs. These are the hubs that provide the psychological analysis of anyone who's in the care of counterterrorism policing, and that they're trying to divert in a nice way through care. These are teams led by consultant psychologists or psychiatrists in 3 cities, Manchester, London, and Birmingham. Every medic working there has high-level security clearance, and they sit inside counterterrorism policing HQs. And what they do is quite astonishing, and have obtained all of this through FOI requests. They effectively are an information superhighway working in 2 directions, with secure information, classified information coming from MI5, from counterterrorism policing, into these hubs where medics sit, and also medical information going the other way. And these are the places that basically do the assessment of you to see what you will need from the welfare state to stop you on your path towards terrorism. So these clinicians, they help with investigations, they provide consultancy in terms of medical advice for that person's diagnoses. They obtain medical records without consent to pass them to the investigating officers. They formulate how your mental health condition affects your risk of terrorism. And when relevant, they will break out the classified information about what you've been doing online, what you've been doing in person, and they will take that to local doctors if they feel that you really are on the wrong path and immediately need to be stopped. Then this is how you end up in hospital, because they'll take that secret information, bring it to your GP, who knows that you've got this and that condition. And, in some cases, this meets the threshold for being detained in a hospital. So those are the 3 programs where counterterrorism policing and MI5 are involved in very broad social policy kind of work, using all the tools of the welfare state to try and divert somebody, and not just prosecution, not just, surveillance and repression. So these are all covert, and you're never aware that what you've been given through these programs has come because of the involvement of counterterrorism officers. So thanks for sitting with me through that kind of empirical description of the 3 different programs. We will come back to them. But at this point, it bears asking, why is this significant, and also how to research it? Well, how is slightly easier, in that no one you ask in the counterterrorism police or MI5, if you can even find them, is going to answer these questions, because these programs are all classed as sensitive, not secret, but sensitive. So I'm sure there's worse out there. So the methodology that you have to use when dealing with, well, particularly the UK's security apparatus, is FOI requests. And then those will be denied under the National Security Exemption. So you then appeal them through the Information Commissioner's Office. And eventually this ends up being really successful, because quite a lot of the time, the exemption to deny you the papers on these programs is being improperly applied. So in the sort of 2-3 years I've been doing this, I now have the whole in order to give these kind of presentations, but it really does take that long, going back and forth with the ICO. There's also been some off-the-record conversations, which I'm possibly going to allude to, but not very specifically. Why is this significant? Why is it significant that the very high forms of policing, intelligence agencies, counterterrorism, security agencies, why is it significant that they would suddenly be using the tools of the welfare state rather than prosecution and investigation? So my answer to why this is so significant is to lean on governmentality theory. So in a way, I'm going to take you back to my era, back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when governmentality was all the rage. And the key thinker I'm drawing on in this work is Mitchell Dean. He's wonderful. And he's got a particular, he's like the number one theorist of governmentality, really, but also got a very specific article on sectoral separation. So how different state agencies basically do different work, and why this happens in liberal governmentality. And that's, of course, very useful if you want to say that it's novel and strange that high policing is doing welfare work. So governmentality for Dean outlines liberalism's normative commitment to liberty and limited government. And it means that, there is a difference to authoritarian regimes, and the police agencies are limited in their reach compared to authoritarian regimes. Liberalism retains a fear of direct state intrusion as potentially governing too much and destroying that capability for civil society to be inventive and profit-making, etc., etc. So this is, Foucault's theory. And Dean looks at how this affects government, and it basically arranges government around how little can we intervene for each particular problem that we find. And this leads to categorizations of people in the population and what agencies will need to deal with them and how to make sure that they contribute to society and that they govern themselves. So the aim of liberal governmentality is to make you govern your own choices in a way that the state approves of. You become economically productive, not a drain on the state. So liberalism and liberal governmentality for Dean is all about how social policy agencies, they are disciplinary. They're not a million miles away from police. They do coerce, but at a lower level of repression. So there's like a spectrum of agencies rather than a sharp distinction between care and repression. So care, health care, social care, education, all of these agencies will sit on the same spectrum as policing and security agencies, but they are on a spectrum. They are separated from each other. They do different work with different categories of people. So this is Dean's theory of why we don't allow security services and police into the classroom, for example. This is a kind of picture of what he writes and why it might be strange to involve intelligence and security agencies in care and vice versa. He breaks the whole of sort of social policy, public policy, into how liberal governmentality identifies broadly 5 categories of people. And for each category, there's a kind of decreasing level of ability to manage one's own life and how much intervention the state is required to offer. So he goes through all these groups, and he reserves police and especially intelligence and security for Group E, where the state feels it has no other option but to use, quite significant repression to deal with that category of people. So this is a picture of Group A, Group B, Group C, Group D, and in the middle you have the care agencies and their varying levels of intervention in people's lives according to what the state thinks that they need and should be doing. So you have care separated from policing because they do different work with slightly different categories of people. So this is the answer as to why it's strange that counterterrorism police and MI5 are suddenly now using the techniques of Group C and D, such as providing social services, mental health care, or even putting people in inpatient care because they are fundamentally, deemed unable to manage their lives at that particular moment, and they have to go into an institution. So that's a theoretical sort of frame for why it's strange to mix up the terrain of different agencies. But of course, nothing comes out of nowhere. And in the last few decades, there's been a rise of kind of agencies using the language of vulnerability to mean something very particular. And this is kind of muddying the waters. We're not quite yet at intelligence agencies doing welfare work, but in the middle, specifically around preventing violent extremism, there was a rise in the language of vulnerability. And this was to denote people who are in need right now. They have a certain deficit, certain needs, socially, medically, economically, that could become dangerous in the future. So vulnerability is this dynamic model that says, in need now, potentially dangerous tomorrow. And that's the central logic in sort of preventing violent extremism, that care now is the solution to future disorder, to future terrorism. And here you start to get the sort of beginnings of blurry programs that cross those boundaries. You get the Troubled Families program, you get Preventing Violent Extremism, you get the kind of work on gangs that merges securitization with also social services and care. So this didn't come out of nowhere. There is a sort of prelude here. But that has never involved MI5 and counterterrorism policing. Blurry as the middle period was, it involved police officers in the local area. It was not intelligence agencies, and it was not their policing arm, the counterterrorism police. So there are some really unique identifying features of the three programs that I opened with, and I'm going to take you back to now, is that they particularly are framing subjects that Dean would put in Group E that need harsh repression and prosecution, with care and social provision. And this is a covert work as well at the same time. And we're assessing their needs as well as their risk at the same time to design a support package, but also to monitor compliance with their medical appointments and medication regimes. So some of these programs, that's a really astounding level of surveillance that hasn't been used before. Through these programs now, it's very possible and very easy to monitor whether somebody is turning up to their appointments with their psychologist, whether they're still taking their medication and ordering it, through the chemist the way we all do. And these are on giant databases, the particular one here called NHS Spine, where you don't even need to go through the Data Protection Act for the police to see this kind of information. So consent is not sought with any of these three programs, and even Prevent requires consent when you get to the intervention stage. But all of these three programs involving the security and intelligence agencies are led covertly. So you never know that, the house you've received or the apprenticeship or the social care, you never know that actually that person is reporting back to the security agencies covertly. These programs are also very novel in that before now, classified information was classified information. It was protected at great efforts were made to keep this information within the policing realm. But now these programs operate with a two-way information highway where information goes back and forth, including classified information. So the clinicians working in the hubs to determine what somebody's profile is, what they need to stop them becoming a terrorist, they receive all the classified information. Well, one hub receives all the classified information because they have the highest level of security clearance. So they can see in full what MI5 and CT policing know in order to help them work out what the mental health intersection is with this behavior. Right. And then they work out what is the impact of illness on the counterterrorism risk. And they transmit that back to the police officers. So in terms of what these hubs can do, in sort of three brief lines, they can obtain medical records for the intelligence agencies and counterterrorism investigations. This is something that the intelligence and security agencies can't do by themselves, and they also need help with, because medical confidentiality is difficult to navigate. So these clinicians, they help them phrase the public interest justification to obtain those medical records. They are particularly looking for conditions of schizophrenia, psychosis, and autism. These are the three that, through their work, they've decided have the most relevance for work on risk, protective factors, and dangerousness. Novel as well is that these kind of health and counterterrorism hubs, they can and do monitor you in the community to make sure that you're being compliant with your treatment plan. If you're not, God help you, you will move up the risk flag register. If you are, you'll never know that they were surveilling your attendance at these medical appointments. And the most sort of striking thing that this health and counterterrorism collaboration does is that where necessary, it breaks out classified information, intelligence, into frontline services. Now, this is your GP. This is your psychologist, your counselor. They take classified intelligence and they find a form of words, in inverted commas, which is effectively gisting what the police know about you and giving it to your GP, your psychologist, anyone who might have the power to change your treatment plan or even section you in the hospital. So sectioning is where you're put involuntarily in a psychiatric hospital because you're a risk to yourself or others. So the hubs assist this. There's no other way to put it. The hubs assist with that practice. So let me just have a little sip of my drink. This is all covert, non-statutory stuff, and it crosses the line between people under investigation, also people coming to the attention of Prevent, who are considered a slightly higher risk. Yeah. And PLP in particular, police-led partnerships, are all about distributing care and welfare resources at a premium level, not available to the rest of us, I would say, to divert the vulnerable person away from terrorism. And this is not owned by your local authority. This is owned by the counterterrorism police. And intelligence and security agencies are, covertly employing the welfare state to do this because care can potentially be useful to them as a tactic to stop people entering the space where they need to be prosecuted and arrested. So on the right is a picture of an early report that we did through FOI requests on the vulnerability support hubs. It's not up to date. That one came out a few years ago. And since then, we've obtained so many FOI packages, hauls of information, that we know that the report is slightly off in some places, but it still serves as a decent intro to this kind of terrain. So the hubs obtain medical information in various ways, but the NHS spine is very crucial to them. It's a computer data set looking for particular conditions. And then the clinicians with the CT officers will combine your medical condition, flag it in terms of risk, combine that with your surveillance information to make a combined risk score of either red, orange, or green. And this determines what happens to you. So we'll start at the most severe level, red, where there are unknowns concerning the mental health impact on your CT risk. So you've definitely got one of the conditions named above that prompt such concern from these teams. They're at a severe level. Perhaps you're not following your treatment regime, you're not taking your medication, and the team working with counterterrorism police is really worried about the impact of your mental health on your risk of terrorism. So this is known as a red rag rating. And in this situation, the information superhighway works from the covert space and information is taken into the open space. So the doctors working with the intelligence agents will find a way of framing what it is you're doing, such as attempting to obtain weapons, for example, and find a way of communicating that sometimes it used to be over the phone, to your GP. And then your GP will make a decision about recommending that you might be detained under the Mental Health Act. Importantly, the Mental Health Act is being followed. All the procedures are being followed. The counterterrorism officers are not putting you in the hospital themselves. Appropriate procedures are being followed, but there are big questions about whether it's okay to use sometimes MI5 information to do that, because that's going to put a particular steer on the GP to reassess your dangerousness to other people. Orange is more legally dubious. Whereas red follows the Mental Health Act, orange is possibly the more worrying allocation of risk. So orange, you have one of the conditions they consider relevant to counterterrorism risks, so schizophrenia, autism, psychosis. You have one of those conditions, you're engaging with some form of treatment, and it has, your condition has a known impact on your counterterrorism risk from police surveillance. And at this stage, we get into some really interesting information sharing, where information comes from the open world and enters the covert domain to affect how you are managed and monitored without your consent. So the clinicians are NHS professionals, and they know how to speak to other NHS professionals. They know the rules on public interest declaration, all kinds of things. So they help the police to navigate medical confidentiality. They can also contact your psychologist, your counsellor, your GP, and they can say, well, police are looking at this person and they're all right now. But if they consider, traveling to Syria, or they start talking about, leading demonstrations for, I don't know, a Nordic resistance movement, then they set up what they call tripwires. So if the person says anything along those lines, the medic is then obliged to report it back to the hubs. And that information goes straight from, your counselling session, your GP, into the covert space, and it becomes discussed by CT policing. And that's pretty worrying. Similarly worrying is that they can monitor your attendance at your medical appointments, your compliance with medication, and they can liaise with your medics confidentially if they want to. So information here becomes intelligence. Your medical information becomes intelligence that is used by the intelligence agencies to manage you in the community and to increase the constraints that you're experiencing or decrease them if you're, compliant. But you never know this is happening. And then finally, green. The clinicians identify no mental health impact on counterterrorism risk, and they don't deal with you. And at that point, your file is closed. You never know that you were looked at in the first place. This is all legal. Data sharing agreements are in place between the NHS and these hubs and the counterterrorism police. But these have not been through Parliament, and they are not on a statutory footing. So the cart is really leading the horse here. It's not Parliament deciding that these systems should be set up. The Intelligence and Security Committee, does have knowledge of them, but it's not been through Parliament any wider than that. These are non-statutory programs. I'll give you a visual example of how this works. These are red examples. A man with extreme right-wing views, who also has schizophrenia, had previously refused to engage with Prevent. He began shouting abuse at ethnic minorities in the street. A right-wing demonstration will occur in several days in his town. So combining his medical and police data, he was awarded a red risk ranking in that he wasn't controlled on his medication, he wasn't complying with medics, and also his behavior was becoming wilder. And they decided that, with this trigger of this demonstration about to come in a few days' time to his town, they put him in the hospital. So what they did was they broke out classified information to a local doctor dealing with him. And the local doctor decided that, yes, the conditions under the Mental Health Act were found. And so he was put in a hospital against his will. Another red example dealt with by the hubs, a man with psychosis. He's receiving home treatment. So, he's in touch with medics. He's receiving care. Police know that he has some new interests. Obviously, that's possibly extremism related, and they don't want to publish it in the public domain. And nothing to do with this man, the Westminster Bridge attack then happened. So this is interpreted by the hub as a triggering event. And unfortunately, our man is then seen driving on the M5. It's interpreted by the police surveilling him that this is reconnaissance for an attack. And so this information is passed again to local clinicians. And because of how this classified information is broken out and given to the doctors, it's interpreted as a severe risk for the public, and he's detained under the Mental Health Act. And, that doesn't happen to anybody else, right? And it's never happened before. So there's reasons to be concerned about this. The flow of classified information from the covert space to clinicians, in the hubs, to local doctors. This is an information superhighway. And I have concerns about the level of influence that this information has when it comes from the security services, is put in an appropriate form that can be shared and given to health professionals. Is that too much influence? Or you could see it another way. The police see it as the facilitation of appropriate information transfer, that you can't make a decision under the Mental Health Act unless you see what they see. So there's two ways of seeing it, really. Is it legal? Yes, it is. But it's an interesting legality. So the Data Protection Act, the Mental Health Act, and the Public Interest Test on personal information sharing, all of these are being followed in these programs, but, pushed to an extreme. And there are interesting ways to kind of put this in context. And during the pandemic, archival research was all we could really do on digital archives. We couldn't leave home or anything. So I was researching this historic episode in the Soviet Union, which is notorious for the KGB collaborating with mental health services. And what they did was a massive human rights abuse. They would, democracy activists would come to their attention as their version of extremists, right? And medics were encouraged to understand the continuation of mental illness under the perfect socialist system. I'm being sarcastic. And one of the conditions they came up with was sluggish schizophrenia, which means slow developing schizophrenia, which doesn't follow any etiology that we would have here. It's a different medical etiology. But they applied this to people who couldn't fit in within the socialist system, who didn't cooperate. And they were diagnosed as sluggish schizophrenics. And so they were put in hospital. And it's an interesting period in history, whether this was just completely cynical human rights abuse. Of course, it was a human rights abuse. But also, this did have a Soviet medical literature on it. It was understood by the local doctors, at least, that this condition was real. So there's all kinds of ambiguity there about the cooperation between psychiatry and secret services. From that, we got our laws on it being inappropriate to ever pathologize someone's political or religious beliefs when we're assessing their mental health and mental illness. So our system definitely doesn't do that. But what it does do is use the loopholes in the existing legislation to break out that classified surveillance information and to give it to your GP, to give it to your psychologist, to emphasize that you're of increasing risk to yourself and others around you, and that, you should be detained. And information goes back the other way as well. All your health information can be leveraged and taken into these covert spaces without you giving the slightest bit of permission. And earlier I used an abbreviation of the ICFS. So it's important for you to know that right now, the hubs that were in London, Birmingham, and Manchester are being incorporated into a national system called the Integrated Clinical Formulation Service. So if anything ever has a really dull bureaucratic name, you know it's dangerous. You know, it's hiding in plain sight. So the Integrated Clinical Formulation Service is coming your way, and this will nationalize this system of health and counterterrorism cooperation. I will be finding out more shortly as to how broad its remit will be, but probably it will include prevent, MAC, so closed MI5 subjects, counterterrorism investigations, and intelligence. So I imagine it will be pretty broad because that's where we've got with the pilots. So heading towards the end now as to how exactly you map someone's potential risk and needs. So these is from the FOI requests that recently were successful. And this is a picture of what they do. It's called the 5 Ps model. And the medics in the hub will look at your complex needs, which could include homelessness, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and map that alongside any psychiatric diagnoses you have, and then formulate that. And formulate that means write a narrative about how it impacts your risk of terrorism. I'm not entirely sure how this is a scientific process, because obviously mental illness has no bearing on terrorism risk, but they're using formulation from forensics medics studies, you know, on risk of crime and extending it to terrorism. Yeah, and yeah, as we've stated, all this information comes from your local authority frontline services without your consent. We're used to having a separation of powers inbuilt within liberal democracy, but you know, we have that at the level of government, of separation between executive, legislature, and judiciary. Do we need a separation of frontline services to stop any one body having too much power and too much potential to abuse that power? Are MAC, PLP, and the hubs too powerful in their combination of welfare, tools, medical surveillance, and also the ability to use all the tools available to the intelligence agencies and the counterterrorism police? I mean, this is a very wide range of powers that are accessible through these programs. It's also non-statutory, hasn't gone through Parliament, but is framed as a good. It's framed as breaking down barriers in information sharing and enabling the prevention of lone actor terrorists. It is possible to see this as a good thing, and some people I've spoken to do see it as a good thing, that while this is invasive and covert, the two-way information superhighway between health and CT could be an improvement on what went before. So before, we had a lot of TPIMs, and a TPIM is a terrorism prevention investigation measure. It is the replacement of the control orders that were deemed illegal in about 2011, I think. Now, we used to have quite a few TPIMs and a lot of control orders. So there were 52 between 2005 and 2011. And they're incredibly invasive. They're basically detention in your home, wearing an ankle tag. You can be moved away from your family and, you know, be housed in a different city, and you've got no recourse to change that. It's basically detention in all but name, without any kind of prosecution. Usually used when they can't prosecute you, because it might alert or reveal the presence of an MI5 agent. Now, we used to have quite a few of these control orders and TPIMs, but at the moment, there's only 2 currently in operation in the UK. So 2 people are under house arrest, possibly separated from their families, on an ongoing basis, renewed every year. These are really harsh measures. And the argument made is that the information superhighway, the health counterterrorism collaboration, is a way of ensuring the safety of the public without having to use the vastly repressive measures of house arrest. That you can use health to divert people, to make sure they're getting treatment, but also to continue monitoring them through police and intelligence tools, just in case they are still dangerous. So the argument made is that these invasive powers could be better than the alternative, because you always have to do something. Now, that is a police argument, as you'll tell. But, never mistake correlation for causation. There has been a limited number of TPIMs in force for longer than the health CT programs have existed. So don't, assume cause there. It's, just two things happening at the same time. Yeah, so coming to the conclusion, and back to the central question, why is it significant that this pre-crime machine exists? Why is it significant that counterterrorism and intelligence agents are using care, health, social services, housing, all kinds of social policy tools rather than investigation? And the answer, I think, is that traditionally, liberal governmentality would require either or. You would either be a subject of frontline care services, or policing and security agencies would be managing you. It would never really be both. And this slowly blurred through the late 90s and into the early 2000s with preventive police work, then prevent, and the concept of vulnerability. That was all early work where the police contributed to prevention and care. But involving MI5 and CT policing is a different level, in this machine. Combining the powers of the intelligence agencies with the welfare state is pretty significant. And it's, a complicated picture to draw there, that in some ways it's the completion of the liberal project because it's using the least possible repression. It's not house arrest, it's not execution. This is the least possible repression and the most possible use of care. So it's, in one way, it's a completion of liberal governmentality, but at the same time, it's also its end, because liberal governmentality had a sectoral separation. It said that you would be dealt with by the care agencies or by the police and intelligence agencies, not both. It relied upon categorization that was stable. I wanted to, just conclude with something kind of funny, and excuse me while I have a drink of my Coke. For all of the high-tech tools that we associate with surveillance and MI5, the FOI results have really quite amusing moments where absolutely nobody is trusted to write their own email, and a paper form is provided for literally every eventuality. There is a lot of low-tech bureaucracy going on in these programs. This is not a high-tech program. So MAC, the hubs, PLP, they rely on paper forms, email templates for liaising between different parts of the NHS. They rely on Teams conversations. In fact, they talk about them as great because the police and the health officials interrupt each other less than they would do in person. Low tech is also the form of words that people use to communicate classified information to people without security clearance. And there's some amusing parts where the CT officer on these programs has a lot of really serious responsibilities for risk assessment and information. But primarily, what comes up again and again is that their role is to push back against the expectations from pushy police officers that the medics can just simply put their subjective interest in the hospital or simply share medical information without a public interest test. And so there's some amusing kind of low-tech, humbling moments where this pre-crime machine, it looks kind of clunky and kind of low-tech. So I wanted to kind of, dispel any illusion that this is a high-tech, sophisticated thing. It is, but it's also low-tech and relies on paper, teams, and, has organizational sociology problems like every other organization. So to conclude, what does it mean for intelligence and security agencies to be covertly using welfare and care resources as diversion tools? Well, it's both a simultaneous commitment to liberal governmentality, alongside its complete destruction. So it continues the project by categorizing subjects and limiting repressive intervention in their lives. It tries to go with care wherever it can, alongside surveillance. But it totally ends liberal governmentality's methods of having distinct subject groups managed by distinct agencies. And what we have here is the replacement of a static subject, one who is somewhat dangerous or one who needs care, with a dynamic subject categorization, one which shifts and moves and needs surveillance, where an individual is attributed the potential to move abruptly between need and dangerousness. So that's what I think these programs mean. There's a book there, if you want to order it for your library, that talks about the concept of vulnerability that sort of brought us to this point. And that's my 40 minutes done. So I am going to try and stop sharing. Thank you.